Sarah Hayes stood in the doorway of her modest cabin in rural Georgia, staring at the 3 children she had nursed, fed, and raised for 17 years. They called her Mammy, never Mother. But on that humid August morning in 1869, when the plantation records were finally unsealed by federal investigators, she discovered something that would shatter everything she believed about her life. The documents revealed names, dates, and a truth so disturbing that 2 county officials refused to speak of it publicly. What Sarah learned that day would force her to confront a question no mother should ever have to answer. Were they truly her master's children, or had she been deceived in ways far more sinister than she could have imagined? Before we continue with the story of Sarah Hayes and the horrifying secret hidden in those plantation records, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We bring you the darkest, most compelling true stories from America's past. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Let's discover together what really happened on the Grantham estate. The autumn Sarah Hayes arrived at the Grantham plantation was unremarkable in every way except one. She was 19 years old, recently purchased at auction in Savannah, and visibly pregnant. The year was 1852, and the estate sprawled across 800 acres of red Georgia clay, producing cotton and corn in quantities that made Charles Grantham one of the wealthier landowners in Burke County. The main house stood 3 stories tall, painted white with black shutters that never seemed to close completely, giving the windows a perpetually watchful appearance. Charles Grantham was 43, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, along with their infant son. The loss had transformed him from a gregarious host known for elaborate dinner parties into a reclusive figure who spent most evenings in his study, drinking whiskey and reviewing ledgers by candlelight. The household staff whispered that he blamed himself, that he'd insisted his wife travel to Savannah late in her pregnancy against the doctor's advice. Sarah had belonged to a smaller farm near Augusta before the owner's bankruptcy forced the sale of all assets, including the 12 people he'd enslaved. She never spoke of the father of her unborn child, and no one asked. Such questions were considered impolite among the enslaved community. Everyone carried wounds too deep for casual conversation. The overseer, a thin man named Porter with permanently sunburned forearms, assigned Sarah to work in the main house under the supervision of Dinah, the head of household staff who'd served the Grantham family for 26 years. Dinah was in her 50s, gray-haired and efficient, with the kind of stern demeanor that concealed a capacity for unexpected kindness. She took one look at Sarah's condition and assigned her to light duties, mending clothes, preparing vegetables, tending the herb garden behind the kitchen. "You'll work until you can't," Dinah told her matter-of-factly. "Then you'll rest until you can work again. That's how we survive here. Mr. Grantham don't tolerate laziness, but he ain't cruel like some. You do your work, keep your head down. You'll be treated fair enough." Sarah discovered this was largely true. The Grantham plantation operated with cold efficiency rather than brutality. There were rules. No one entered the main house through the front door. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one was permitted in Mr. Grantham's study under any circumstances. But the food rations were adequate, the cabins had solid roofs, and Porter rarely used his whip. It was a kind of prison where the bars were invisible but no less real. In January of 1853, Sarah gave birth to a son she named Thomas. Dinah attended the delivery, along with an elderly woman named Ruth who'd brought more than 80 babies into the world. The labor lasted 14 hours. When it was over, Sarah held her son and felt something she hadn't experienced since her own mother had been sold away when she was 12. Hope. Perhaps not for herself, but for this small life that knew nothing yet of the world's cruelty. She returned to work when Thomas was 3 weeks old, strapping him to her back in the traditional way, the rhythm of her movements lulling him to sleep while she worked. Mr. Grantham never acknowledged the child's presence. To him, Sarah was simply another piece of property that had produced another piece of property, valuable only insofar as both could work. The seasons turned. Sarah proved herself capable and reliable, qualities that earned her grudging respect from the other household staff. She learned the family's preferences. Mr. Grantham took his coffee black with 2 spoons of sugar, preferred his shirts starched to near stiffness, and would not eat fish on Wednesdays for reasons no one could explain. She learned to move through the house like a ghost, visible only when needed, invisible the rest of the time. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child who asked too many questions. By the time he was 3, he'd learned to read from studying the newspapers that lined the kindling box, teaching himself letters and then words with a determination that worried Sarah. Literacy was dangerous for enslaved people in Georgia. The state had laws against teaching them to read, laws backed by severe punishments. But she couldn't bring herself to discourage his hunger for knowledge. Instead, she taught him to hide it, to never let white people see him reading, to pretend ignorance even when he understood everything being discussed around him. "Smart can keep you alive," she told him, "but showing you're smart can get you killed. Remember that, Thomas. Always remember that." In the spring of 1855, everything changed. Mr. Grantham announced his engagement to Margaret Yancey, the 28-year-old daughter of a prominent judge from Augusta. The household exploded into preparation. Every room was cleaned and repainted. New furniture was ordered from Savannah. The gardens were redesigned by a landscape architect from Charleston. Margaret Yancey arrived in June with 14 trunks, 2 personal maids, and expectations that would reshape the entire plantation. She was beautiful in the way of delicate china, with pale skin, auburn hair, and green eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. But there was something brittle about her, a quality Sarah recognized because she'd seen it in abused horses. The constant expectation of pain, the readiness to flinch. The wedding took place in July, a grand affair attended by more than 200 guests. Sarah worked in the kitchen for 3 days straight, preparing dishes she'd never tasted, roasted duck with cherry sauce, 7-layer cakes, custards flavored with vanilla and almond. She watched through the kitchen window as the guests danced on the lawn, their laughter carrying on the humid evening air. It seemed like a scene from another world entirely, one where people could afford to be careless with happiness. Margaret took control of the household with surprising firmness. She rearranged staff assignments, implemented new schedules, and insisted on European-style service that required extensive retraining. She was neither kind nor cruel, simply distant, as if the enslaved people who surrounded her daily were pieces of furniture that happened to move and speak. But she was particularly distant with Sarah. She never looked directly at her, never addressed her by name, referred to her only as the girl, even though Sarah was by then 22 years old. Dinah noticed but offered no explanation, only a warning. Stay out of her sight much as you can. Some folks got their reasons for the way they are, and those reasons ain't our concern. A year after the wedding, Margaret announced she was pregnant. The household's atmosphere transformed overnight. Mr. Grantham, who'd been somber for years, suddenly smiled at dinner, ordered imported wines, spoke enthusiastically about the future. Margaret withdrew even further, spending most of her time in her rooms, seeing no one but her personal maids and the doctor who visited weekly from Augusta. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret suffered constant nausea, headaches so severe she couldn't tolerate light or sound, fainting spells that left her unconscious for hours. The doctor prescribed bed rest and laudanum, both of which she embraced with an intensity that worried the household staff. In March of 1857, she went into labor. The screaming could be heard throughout the entire house, terrible sounds that seemed to last forever. Sarah, working in the kitchen, felt her stomach clench with each cry. She remembered her own labor with Thomas, the pain that had felt like dying. But Margaret's screams had a different quality. Something beyond physical pain, something that sounded like fury. After 23 hours, a baby girl was born. They named her Caroline. But Margaret refused to hold her. She refused to nurse her. She turned her face to the wall and told Mr. Grantham to get the infant out of her sight. The doctor examined Margaret and declared her suffering from nervous exhaustion, a condition that would require months of rest and isolation to cure. He prescribed increased doses of laudanum and complete separation from the baby until she recovered. No one questioned this. Postpartum melancholia was common enough, particularly after difficult births. Mr. Grantham stood in his study that night, holding his newborn daughter completely at a loss. She needed to be fed. She needed constant care. The wet nurse they'd arranged had died 2 weeks earlier from pneumonia, and there wasn't time to find another before the baby starved. Dinah solved the problem. She knocked on the study door and said 5 words. Sarah can nurse the child. Sarah was in her cabin when Dinah came for her. She was nursing Thomas, who was 4 years old and still sometimes wanted the comfort of his mother's breast before sleep. Dinah explained the situation with her characteristic bluntness. Mrs. Grantham couldn't care for baby Caroline. Mr. Grantham needed a wet nurse. Sarah was still nursing Thomas, which meant she had milk. It wasn't a request. It was never a request. Sarah felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She'd heard stories of enslaved women forced to nurse white babies while their own children starved. She'd heard of women whose bodies gave all their milk to their master's children, leaving nothing for their own. But she had no choice, so she stood up, wrapped Thomas in a blanket, and followed Dinah through the dark to the main house. Mr. Grantham met them in the nursery, a room that had been hastily prepared on the 2nd floor. He held Caroline awkwardly, the way men hold babies when they're terrified of breaking them. The infant was screaming, her face red and pinched with hunger. "Feed her," he said to Sarah, and left the room. Sarah sat in the rocking chair and arranged her clothing. She'd fed Thomas just minutes earlier, but she pressed the screaming infant to her breast and felt the small mouth latch on with desperate strength. The crying stopped. The room filled with the sound of suckling and Sarah's own racing heartbeat. Thomas, who'd been silent and wide-eyed through the entire exchange, whispered, "Mama, hush now," Sarah told him. "Everything's gonna be all right." But she knew, even as she spoke the words, that she was lying. Nothing was going to be all right. She could feel it in the way baby Caroline fed with such intensity, such hunger, as if she meant to take everything Sarah had. And in the months that followed, she nearly did. The arrangement began simply enough. Sarah would come to the main house every 4 hours to nurse Caroline. Between feedings, she could return to her cabin to care for Thomas and handle her other duties. But within a week, the schedule had changed. Mr. Grantham decided it was inefficient for Sarah to travel back and forth. She was moved into a small room adjacent to the nursery, a servant's chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked the back gardens. Thomas was left in the cabin with an elderly woman named Mattie, who looked after several children while their parents worked. Sarah saw him only briefly each day, usually in the early morning or late evening when Dinah could spare her for an hour. Each time, Thomas seemed smaller to her, more distant, as if he was slowly disappearing from her life. "Don't forget me, Mama," he said one evening, and Sarah's heart broke into pieces. "Never," she promised. "I could never forget you. You're my son, my own boy." But Caroline became her entire world by necessity. Newborns are relentless, demanding creatures, and Caroline was no exception. She nursed every 2 hours, day and night, for months. She had colic that made her scream for hours, until Sarah learned to lay her on her stomach across her lap and rub her back in slow circles. She developed a rash that covered her entire body, requiring constant baths and applications of calendula ointment. She wouldn't sleep unless someone was holding her, so Sarah learned to sleep sitting upright in the rocking chair, the baby against her chest, waking at the slightest movement. Mr. Grantham visited the nursery daily, usually in the evening. He would stand over the cradle and watch Caroline sleep with an expression Sarah couldn't interpret. It wasn't exactly love. It was more like surveillance, as if he were checking to make sure she still existed. He never asked about Thomas. He never acknowledged that Sarah had her own child who needed her. To him, she was simply a function, a source of nutrition for his daughter, as impersonal as a bottle or a feeding schedule. Margaret never came to the nursery. According to the maids who attended her, she spent her days in bed, drifting in and out of laudanum dreams, occasionally asking about the weather or what was being served for dinner, but never mentioning her daughter. The doctor continued his weekly visits and pronounced her condition unchanged. Nervous exhaustion, requiring complete rest and isolation. As Caroline grew, Sarah found herself developing feelings she'd never expected. Affection, tenderness, even a kind of love for this child who wasn't hers. She told herself it was natural, that any woman who spends every waking moment caring for an infant would form an attachment. But it felt more complicated than that. It felt like betrayal. Of Thomas. Of herself. Of everything she believed about survival and resistance in a system designed to destroy both. When Caroline was 6 months old, Margaret died. She'd taken too much laudanum one evening, whether intentionally or accidentally no one could say. They found her in the morning, pale and cold in her elaborate bed, her face peaceful for perhaps the first time since her wedding day. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by prominent families from across the region. Mr. Grantham stood beside the grave with Caroline in his arms, stone-faced and silent. Sarah watched from a distance, holding Thomas's hand, feeling the guilt of being glad that Margaret was gone, because it meant Caroline would need her even more completely now. After Margaret's death, the household settled into a new rhythm. Mr. Grantham became both father and mother to Caroline, though in practice this meant Sarah continued to provide all actual care while he made decisions about her upbringing. He hired a tutor for when she'd be old enough for lessons. He ordered elaborate dresses from Savannah and Charleston. He commissioned a portrait painter to capture her image every year on her birthday. When Caroline was 2, Mr. Grantham married again, this time to a widow named Helen Bradford from Macon. Helen was 41, practical rather than beautiful, with 3 grown children from her first marriage and no interest in having more. She ran the household with efficient indifference, neither cruel nor kind, simply ensuring everything functioned smoothly. She never interfered with Sarah's care of Carolyn. 2 years after that marriage, Helen gave birth unexpectedly to twins, a boy and a girl they named Robert and Elizabeth. The pregnancy had been a surprise, the delivery quick and without complications. Helen recovered rapidly, but she had no interest in nursing. She'd hired a wet nurse for her first 3 children and saw no reason to change that practice now. Except there was a problem. The wet nurse they'd arranged became ill with influenza and couldn't take the position, and Sarah was still nursing Caroline, who was 4 but refused to be weaned. Mr. Grantham made the obvious decision. Sarah would nurse all 3 children. Dinah brought Sarah the news with an apologetic expression. "I know it ain't right," she said quietly. "I know it ain't fair. But you know how it is." Sarah did know. She always knew. She took the twins into her care, arranged them on her lap with Caroline curled against her side, and fed them all while Thomas watched from the doorway with eyes that had grown old far too young. He was 9 years old now, tall and thin, working in the fields because he was too old for the cabin nursery and too young for skilled work. "You got 3 children now," he said to her one evening, his voice flat. "White children. Must be nice having children that matter." "Thomas, no." Sarah reached for him, but he stepped back. "It's fine, Mama. I understand how it works. I've always understood." He left the room, and Sarah sat in the darkness with Caroline sleeping against her shoulder, feeling the truth of his words like a knife between her ribs. The years passed. Caroline grew into a bright, affectionate child who called Sarah Mammy and seemed genuinely fond of her. Robert and Elizabeth were more difficult. They were demanding, prone to tantrums, and showed early signs of their father's cold temperament. But Sarah cared for them all with the same meticulous attention, because her survival depended on it. If anything happened to these children, she would be blamed. If they were unhappy, she would be punished. Her entire existence had become synonymous with their well-being. Thomas grew up at a distance from her. He worked in the fields, learned carpentry from the estate's handyman, and became a quiet, serious young man who spoke rarely and smiled never. When they saw each other, which was seldom, he was polite but distant, calling her ma'am instead of mama, as if they were strangers rather than mother and son. "I lost him," Sarah told Dinah one night, the words pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "You didn't lose him," Dinah said. "He's just protecting himself the only way he knows how. Can't blame a boy for that." But Sarah did blame someone. She blamed Mr. Grantham, who'd taken her body's very capacity to nurture and redirected it toward his own children. She blamed the system that made such theft legal and routine. And she blamed herself, though she knew that was irrational, for not finding a way to resist. In April of 1865, word reached the plantation that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Confederacy had fallen, and with it, the entire system of slavery that had defined the South for 2.5 centuries. Mr. Grantham called a meeting of all the enslaved people on the estate. There were 63 of them, gathered in front of the main house on a warm spring evening. He stood on the porch, his face gray with exhaustion and something that might have been defeat. "You're free," he told them. "As of now, you're all free. You can stay and work for wages, or you can go. The choice is yours." There was silence. No one cheered. No one wept. They simply stood there trying to comprehend what freedom meant when you'd never known anything but bondage. That night Sarah sat in the small room adjacent to the nursery, still her room after 13 years, and tried to imagine leaving. But where would she go? She had no family, no connections, no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on her back. And she had Caroline, Robert, and Elizabeth, who depended on her completely. Mr. Grantham had never been deliberately cruel to her. The plantation was the only home she could remember clearly. The practical choice, the safe choice, was to stay. The next morning she told Mr. Grantham she would remain and work for wages. He looked relieved and offered her $7 a month plus room and board. It was exploitation, though not as severe as slavery had been. She accepted because the alternative was starvation. Most of the formerly enslaved people made the same choice, at least initially. Some left within weeks or months, drawn by promises of opportunity in Atlanta or Savannah or up north. But others stayed because leaving required resources they didn't have and courage they couldn't quite summon after a lifetime of being told they were property. Thomas left in June. He was 16, tall and capable, literate thanks to his years of secret study. He came to Sarah's room one evening and said, "I'm going to Savannah, going to find work on the docks, maybe sign onto a ship. I need to see what's out there, Mama." Sarah wanted to beg him to stay. She wanted to tell him the world was dangerous and he was still so young. But she looked at his face and saw the determination there, the desperate need to become something other than what this place had made him. "You write me," she said. "You promise you'll write me." "I promise," he said, and hugged her briefly before pulling away. "I got to go now, before I lose my nerve." She watched him walk down the long drive in the dawn light, carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag, and felt something inside her finally break completely. The years after the war were difficult for everyone, but particularly for the Grantham household. The plantation's income dropped dramatically as the labor force shrank and cotton prices fluctuated wildly. Mr. Grantham sold parcels of land to cover debts. Helen's jewelry was quietly pawned in Augusta. The household staff was reduced to just 5 people: Dinah, Sarah, a cook named Pearl, and 2 men who handled outdoor work and maintenance. Caroline, Robert, and Elizabeth grew up in this diminished world, unaware that they were experiencing decline rather than normalcy. Caroline was their father's favorite, though he'd never admitted it aloud. She was clever and kind, with her mother Margaret's beauty, but none of her brittleness. She read voraciously, played piano beautifully, and asked thoughtful questions about everything from politics to philosophy. The twins, by contrast, seemed determined to embody every negative stereotype of spoiled Southern gentry. Robert was arrogant and lazy, constantly reminding the household staff of their inferior status. Elizabeth was vain and manipulative, skilled at playing her parents against each other to get what she wanted. Sarah continued to care for all 3 children, though the nature of her duties evolved as they aged. By the time Caroline was 14, Sarah's role had shifted from nursemaid to something closer to a personal servant, arranging her clothes, styling her hair, helping her dress for social occasions. She still felt affection for Caroline, even love, though she'd learned to keep those feelings carefully compartmentalized. This was her job now, nothing more. Thomas wrote occasionally, brief letters that arrived every few months describing his life in Savannah. He'd found work at the shipyards, then later as a clerk for a shipping company. He'd learned bookkeeping and navigation. He'd joined a church and made friends. He was building a life, and Sarah was proud of him even as she mourned the distance between them. "Why does Mammy cry when she gets letters?" Elizabeth asked one day, watching Sarah carefully fold one of Thomas's notes and tuck it into her apron pocket. "Because she's foolish," Robert answered before Sarah could respond. "Daddy says colored people are too emotional for their own good." "That ain't true," Caroline said sharply. "Mammy's not foolish. Maybe she misses someone. Maybe the letter is from family." "You don't have family, do you, Mammy?" Elizabeth asked with the casual cruelty of a child who doesn't understand the impact of her words. "I thought all your people died or ran off." Sarah swallowed the rage that rose in her throat and forced her voice to remain level. "I have a son. His name is Thomas. He lives in Savannah." The three children stared at her. It was perhaps the first time Sarah had ever volunteered personal information about her life. "You have a son?" Caroline said slowly. "But I never knew that. Why didn't I know that?" "You never asked, Miss Caroline." Caroline's face flushed, and she looked genuinely distressed. "That's not fair. I should have known. You've been taking care of us our whole lives, and I don't know anything about you." "That's how it's supposed to be," Robert said dismissively. "They're not our friends, Caroline. They're servants. She raised us," Caroline said, her voice rising. "Don't you understand that? She fed us and held us and sat up with us when we were sick. Doesn't that mean anything?" Robert shrugged. "It means she was doing her job. Daddy paid her, didn't he?" The conversation ended there, but something had shifted in Caroline. She started asking Sarah questions about her life before the plantation, about her parents, about Thomas. Sarah answered carefully, never revealing too much, always conscious that these children were still her employer's children, and anything she said could be used against her. In 1868, when Caroline was 16, she announced her intention to attend a female seminary in Macon. Mr. Grantham was reluctant. He preferred to keep her close. But Caroline insisted with the kind of polite stubbornness that eventually wore down opposition. She would go for 2 years, study literature and music and natural philosophy, and then return to prepare for marriage and the management of her own household. The night before Caroline left, she came to Sarah's room for the first time in years. She stood in the doorway, already dressed in traveling clothes, looking nervous. "I wanted to thank you," she said formally, "for everything you've done for me. I know I haven't always... I understand now that things were complicated. Are complicated." Sarah sat on her narrow bed and looked at this young woman she'd nursed and raised, who'd called her mammy but never mother, who'd taken her time and energy and love as if it were simple owed rather than given. "You're a good girl, Miss Caroline," Sarah said, "because it was true and because kindness cost nothing. You study hard and make yourself into someone strong. Will you still be here when I come back?" Caroline asked, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like worry. "I expect so," Sarah said. "Don't have anywhere else to go." Caroline left the next morning. The house felt emptier without her, though Sarah would never have admitted it aloud. In the spring of 1869, everything changed. A letter arrived from the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the federal agency tasked with overseeing reconstruction in the South. The letter requested that Mr. Grantham make available all plantation records relating to enslaved people purchased, born, or sold between 1850 and 1865. It was part of a regional effort to help formerly enslaved people locate separated family members and establish legal documentation of their birth and parentage. Mr. Grantham was furious. He ranted at dinner about federal overreach and the indignity of having his private business examined by government bureaucrats. But he complied, because refusing would bring unwanted scrutiny to the plantation's finances and potentially expose other irregularities in his business practices. 2 agents arrived in August, a white man named Collins and a black man named Freeman, both formally dressed and carrying leather document cases. They set up in the plantation office and spent 3 days reviewing ledgers, bills of sale, birth records, and correspondence. On the 3rd day, Agent Freeman asked to speak with Sarah Hayes. Dinah came to find her in the kitchen where she was helping Pearl prepare preserves. "They want to talk to you," Dinah said, her expression unreadable. "The government men," Something about the old records. Sarah's stomach clenched with unease. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Dinah to the office, trying to imagine what they could possibly want with her. Agent Freeman stood when she entered. He was perhaps 40, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering. He gestured to a chair across from the desk. "Please, sit down, Mrs. Hayes." Mrs. Hayes. No one had ever called her that before. She sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Agent Collins remained standing, shuffling through papers. Agent Freeman opened a leather-bound ledger and turned it so Sarah could see the pages. They were filled with Mr. Grantham's precise handwriting. Names, dates, prices, physical descriptions, notes about health and capability. "Can you read, Mrs. Hayes?" Freeman asked gently. "Yes, sir." "Good. I'm going to show you several entries, and I need you to tell me if you can confirm the information." He pointed to a line near the top of the page. "Is this you?" "Sarah Hayes, purchased September 1852, age 19, pregnant, from the estate auction of Marcus Dalton, price $400. Sarah looked at the words, at the clinical description of her own sale, and felt bile rise in her throat. "Yes, sir, that's me." Freeman turned several pages. "And this entry here, dated January 14th, 1853, it says, Sarah delivered of a male child named Thomas, healthy weight, expected to be suitable for field work at age 10. Is that your son?" "Yes, sir." "And where is Thomas now?" "Savannah, sir. He left after the war. He writes me sometimes." Freeman nodded and made a note. Then he turned more pages, his finger sliding down columns of dates and names until he stopped at an entry from March 1857. "This is where things become complicated, Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly. "I need you to look at this entry carefully and tell me if you notice anything unusual." Sarah leaned forward to read. The entry said, March 18th, 1857. Delivery of female child, Caroline Margaret Grantham, born to Margaret Yancey Grantham, attended by Dr. William Patterson of Augusta. Healthy weight, no complications noted. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "That's Miss Caroline's birth record. What does that have to do with me?" Agent Freeman exchanged a glance with Agent Collins, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Freeman pulled out another document, this one an official form with embossed seals and multiple signatures. "This," Freeman said, "is the birth certificate filed with Burke County for Caroline Grantham. It was submitted by Dr. Patterson in April of 1857, a month after the birth." He laid it on the desk beside the ledger entry. "I need you to read it carefully." Sarah looked at the document. Most of it matched what she'd just read in the ledger. Date of birth, location, parents' names. But then she reached a section at the bottom, filled out in different handwriting, and her breath stopped in her chest. The section was labeled Wet Nurse Employed, and it listed a name. Sarah Hayes. That was expected. But beneath that, in small, precise letters, was another entry. Note: infant bore visible birthmark on left shoulder, 3/4 inch in diameter, resembling dark star. Wet nurse Sarah Hayes inquired about identity of marking, suggesting possible relation. Dr. Patterson noted marking present. No medical concern noted. Sarah's hands began to shake. She looked up at Agent Freeman, her mind refusing to process what she was reading. She whispered. "I don't understand." Freeman's voice was infinitely gentle. "Mrs. Hayes, did you notice Caroline's birthmark when you first began nursing her?" Sarah's mind went back 17 years to that first night in the nursery, to the tiny, screaming infant she'd held against her breast. She'd undressed the baby to check for rashes or injuries, standard practice for a new nursemaid. And yes, there had been a mark on the baby's left shoulder, a dark patch of discolored skin that looked like a small star. Just like the birthmark Thomas had in the exact same place. "Oh God," Sarah breathed. "Oh God, no." Agent Collins spoke for the first time, his voice strained. "We've compared the records extensively, Mrs. Hayes. We've found significant irregularities in the dates and details surrounding Caroline Grantham's birth. We've also located correspondence between Mr. Grantham and Dr. Patterson that suggests—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase what he needed to say. That suggests a financial transaction took place in exchange for certain accommodations in the recording of birth information. Sarah couldn't breathe. The room seemed to be tilting sideways. Are you saying... You can't be saying... We believe, Agent Freeman said carefully, that Caroline Grantham may not be Margaret Yancey Grantham's biological daughter. We believe she may in fact be your daughter, and we believe this information was deliberately obscured through falsified records and bribery. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah heard them, understood them on some level, but couldn't make them connect to reality. It was impossible. It was insane. But even as her mind rejected the possibility, pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Margaret's refusal to hold the baby, her complete rejection of Caroline, the violent way she'd screamed during labor as if giving birth to someone else's pain, the overdose of laudanum that might not have been accidental at all. And Mr. Grantham's face when he'd held Caroline that first time, looking at her not with a father's love, but with a kind of guilty surveillance, as if checking to make sure she wasn't revealing secrets she didn't even know she held. But how? Sarah whispered. How is that even possible? Agent Freeman pulled out more papers, laying them on the desk like cards in a terrible game. We have documents showing that Margaret Yancey Grantham suffered multiple miscarriages before her death. Her personal physician's notes indicate she was likely infertile due to a childhood illness. We have letters from Mr. Grantham to Dr. Patterson discussing his desperation for an heir, his wife's failure to provide one, and his fear that the family line would end with him. He pulled out another letter, this one in Mr. Grantham's distinctive handwriting. In this correspondence from February 1857, Mr. Grantham writes, "The girl Sarah is nearing her time. The timing could not be more providential. If the child is fair-skinned and healthy, we may have a solution to our predicament. Margaret need never know the full truth. She is already so deep in her melancholia that she sees nothing clearly. Arrange matters as we discussed. I will pay whatever price necessary." Sarah's vision blurred. "He stole my baby," she said, her voice breaking. "He stole my daughter and made me raise her thinking she was his." "We believe," Agent Collins said, "that you delivered Caroline in late February or early March of 1857. We believe she was taken from you immediately after birth, before you were fully conscious. We believe Margaret Grantham was given laudanum and told she'd delivered a daughter during a heavily medicated labor she wouldn't remember clearly. And we believe you were brought to the nursery weeks later and told to nurse a child you'd never seen before, not realizing she was your own." "But Thomas," Sarah said desperately, trying to find anything that would make this make sense. "Thomas has the same birthmark. Doesn't that prove Caroline is related to him? Doesn't that prove she's mine?" "Yes," Freeman said simply. "That's exactly what it proves." Sarah didn't remember leaving the office or returning to her room. She found herself sitting on her narrow bed as the sun set, still wearing her apron, her hands twisted together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The knowledge that had been planted in her mind kept trying to grow, sending roots down into her memories, changing everything she thought she'd known about the last 17 years. Caroline was her daughter. The child she'd nursed and raised and loved and resented and cared for with every breath of her being for 17 years was hers. Not Margaret Grantham's, not even truly Charles Grantham's, though he'd signed the papers that said otherwise. Hers, which meant she'd had 2 children, not 1, which meant she'd been separated from her daughter at birth, forced to wet nurse her own child while thinking her a stranger, made to give everything to Caroline while Thomas watched and felt abandoned, which meant every moment of guilt she'd felt about favoring these white children over her own son had been based on a lie so monstrous she could barely comprehend it. Dinah found her there sometime after dark, brought her water and bread Sarah couldn't eat, sat beside her in silence until Sarah could finally speak. "Did you know?" Sarah whispered. "All these years, did you know?" "No," Dinah said firmly. "I swear before God I didn't know. I knew something was strange about it all, Margaret's refusal to see the baby, the way Mr. Grantham acted about it. But I thought it was just her melancholia. just the tragedy of her mind breaking. I never imagined. He stole my child, Sarah said. Right out of my body, he stole her. I know. And made me take care of her for 17 years. Made me love her while my son grew up thinking I'd chosen white children over him. I know. What do I do? Sarah's voice cracked. What the hell do I do with this? Dinah had no answer. There was no answer. No precedent for this kind of violation, this kind of theft. The agents returned the next morning. They wanted to speak with Mr. Grantham, wanted to confront him with the evidence they'd compiled. Agent Freeman asked if Sarah wanted to be present for that conversation. She said yes, because she needed to see his face when he was forced to admit what he'd done. They gathered in Mr. Grantham's study, the room Sarah had never been permitted to enter during all her years of servitude. It was lined with books, dominated by a massive desk covered in papers and ledgers. Mr. Grantham sat behind that desk looking older than his 60 years, grey-faced and hollow-eyed. Agent Collins laid out the documents methodically. The ledgers, the letters, the birth certificates with their inconsistencies, the testimony from Dr. Patterson's widow, who'd found her late husband's private journals describing the arrangement. Mr. Grantham listened in silence, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. When Agent Collins finished, the room filled with a silence so complete, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Is any of this disputed? Agent Freeman finally asked. Mr. Grantham looked at Sarah for the first time. His eyes were empty of everything except exhaustion. No, he said quietly. It's all true. Sarah felt something inside her shatter at the confirmation. Some part of her had hoped desperately that it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be explained away. But here was the truth, stated plainly in his own voice. Why? She whispered. How could you do that? Mr. Grantham looked down at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was flat, empty of emotion. Margaret couldn't have children. We'd tried for 3 years. She'd miscarried 6 times, each one worse than the last. The doctors said her womb was damaged, that she'd never carry a child to term. And I needed an heir. The plantation, the family name, everything depended on having someone to pass it to. So you decided to steal mine, Sarah said, rage beginning to burn through the shock. You were pregnant when I bought you. Grantham continued as if she hadn't spoken. I didn't plan any of this initially. But as your time approached, I started thinking about possibilities. The child you were carrying, if it was light-skinned enough, if it was healthy, it could solve everything. No one would question a baby's legitimacy if they thought Margaret had delivered it. And you? You'd never know the difference. You'd still nurse the child, still care for it. Nothing would really change for you. Nothing would change. Sarah's voice rose. You took my daughter. You made me raise her thinking she belonged to someone else. She was well cared for, Grantham said. And there was something in his voice that might have been defensiveness. She was fed, clothed, educated, given every advantage. She grew up in this house instead of in a slave cabin. I made her my legal heir. How is that worse than the life she would have had as your daughter? Sarah stood up so quickly her chair fell backward. Because she was mine, because I had a right to know my own child. Because you made me love her while hating myself for loving her, made me feel guilty for every moment I spent with her instead of with Thomas. You destroyed my relationship with my son to keep your lie secret. I paid you, Grantham said, his voice hardening. After the war, I paid you wages to care for her. You were compensated. Compensated? Sarah laughed, a wild, broken sound. You think $7 a month compensates for stealing a child? Agent Freeman cleared his throat. Mr. Grantham, you understand that this constitutes fraud. You falsified birth records, bribed a physician, and misrepresented the parentage of a child for your own financial benefit. Under federal law, this is a criminal offense. Caroline is my daughter, Grantham said firmly. I raised her. I loved her. I gave her everything. That makes her mine, regardless of whose blood runs in her veins. The law doesn't agree with you, Agent Collins said. Parentage is a matter of biology and legal documentation. The documentation was falsified. The biology supports Mrs. Hayes's claim. What claim? Grantham looked at Sarah with something like fear for the first time. What are you planning to do? Sarah realized she had no idea. She hadn't thought beyond the confrontation, beyond making him admit the truth. The idea that she had some kind of legal claim to Caroline, that she could somehow undo 17 years of deception, seemed impossible. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Grantham plantation intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Rising tension. The legal situation was complicated in ways Sarah couldn't fully understand. Agent Freeman explained it to her in the office late one evening, spreading papers across the desk and trying to make sense of state law, federal regulations, and the chaos of Reconstruction-era jurisprudence. In theory, he said, you have a strong case for claiming Caroline as your daughter. The evidence is substantial. The birthmark, the falsified records, the correspondence, Dr. Patterson's journals. But in practice, there are significant obstacles. What kind of obstacles? Sarah asked. Caroline is legally Charles Grantham's daughter, according to recorded documents. Overturning that would require going to court, presenting all this evidence publicly, and convincing a Georgia judge to rule against a prominent white landowner in favor of a formerly enslaved black woman. It's possible, but... He trailed off, and Sarah heard all the unspoken words in that silence. But unlikely, she finished. Very unlikely, Freeman admitted. Particularly because Caroline herself is now legally an adult. She turned 18 last March, which means she has the right to determine her own identity and family connections. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. You're saying it doesn't matter what the truth is. It only matters what Caroline believes. Essentially, yes. If Caroline accepted you as her mother, if she wanted to acknowledge the relationship, that would strengthen your case immeasurably. But if she refuses, if she insists on maintaining her identity as Charles Grantham's daughter, he spread his hands, then there's very little anyone can do. Does she know? Sarah asked. Does Caroline know any of this? Not yet. We wanted to speak with you first, determine how you wanted to proceed before bringing her into it. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Caroline had always been kind to her, affectionate even. But Sarah was still mammy to her, still a servant despite the wages she now earned. Would Caroline believe this story? Would she want it to be true? Or would she reject it entirely, cling to the identity she'd always known, refuse to acknowledge that the woman who'd raised her was actually her mother? And what about Thomas? He'd already lost so much of his relationship with Sarah because of Caroline. How would he react to learning that his sister, his actual biological sister, had been raised as a white child of privilege while he'd worked in the fields? I need to talk to Thomas, Sarah said. Before we do anything else, I need to talk to my son. She wrote to him that night, a long letter she rewrote 4 times, trying to find words adequate for what needed to be said. In the end, she simply told him the facts. The agents had found evidence that Caroline was her daughter, stolen at birth and passed off as white. She asked him to come home, said she needed him, couldn't face what was coming without him. The letter took 8 days to reach Savannah, and 4 more days for Thomas to arrange time away from his work and travel back to Burke County. When he walked up the long drive to the plantation, Sarah almost didn't recognize him. He was 23 now, broad-shouldered and serious-faced, dressed in a respectable suit that marked him as a working man with steady income. He looked so much like his father that Sarah's breath caught in her throat, though she hadn't thought about that man in years. They sat together in her small room, and Sarah told him everything. Thomas listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his hands resting on his knees. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's why you favored her. All those years, I thought you loved her more than me because she was white, because she mattered more. But it was something else. Some part of you knew, didn't you? Some part of you recognized your own child." "I didn't know," Sarah said desperately. "I swear to you, I didn't know. If I'd known..." "If you'd known what? You'd have loved me more? Paid more attention to me?" Thomas's voice was harsh. Or would you have done exactly the same thing because you had no choice? I don't know, Sarah admitted. I honestly don't know. But I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry for all of it. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out over the plantation grounds. What are you going to do? Are you going to tell her? The agents think she should know. They think it's her right to know the truth about her own birth. And what about my rights? Thomas said. Do I have any say in whether my sister gets to know we're related? Or is this just another thing that gets decided for me? I want you to be part of this, Sarah said. Whatever we do, I want us to do it together. Thomas turned to face her. His eyes were wet, though his voice remained steady. She got everything, Mama. Everything that should have been split between us, she got all of it. The house, the education, the respect, the future. And now you want to tell her she's really one of us? You think that changes anything? You think she's going to give up being white to be black? I don't know what she'll do, Sarah said. But she deserves to know the truth. Maybe, Thomas said. Or maybe the truth just hurts people and changes nothing. But he agreed to stay, at least until they'd spoken with Caroline. She'd returned from seminary for the summer and was in the house now, probably reading in the library or playing piano in the parlor. She had no idea her entire world was about to shift beneath her feet. They told Caroline 3 days later, in the same office where Sarah had first learned the truth. Agent Freeman insisted on being present, along with Thomas and Sarah. Mr. Grantham was explicitly excluded. Freeman thought his presence would make honest conversation impossible. Caroline entered the room looking puzzled, but not particularly concerned. She wore a pale blue dress, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style she'd learned at seminary. She looked every inch the Southern lady she'd been raised to be. "You wanted to speak with me?" she asked, addressing Agent Freeman with the polite deference expected of well-bred young women. "Please sit down, Miss Grantham," Freeman said. "We have some information about your birth that you need to hear." Caroline sat, her hands folded in her lap, her expression shifting to confusion when she saw Sarah and Thomas. "I don't understand. What does my birth have to do with them?" There was no gentle way to say it, so Freeman simply laid out the evidence, the documents, the letters, the testimony, the birthmark. He spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, building the case methodically, point by point, until the conclusion was inescapable. Caroline's face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of blank shock that reminded Sarah painfully of how she'd felt when she'd first learned the truth. "No," Caroline said when Freeman finished. "That's not possible. I'm Charles Grantham's daughter. My mother was Margaret Yancey Grantham. This is insane." "Your mother," Agent Freeman said gently, "is Sarah Hayes, the woman who nursed you, raised you, and cared for you your entire life." Caroline looked at Sarah for the first time, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the moment when it clicked into place. The birthmark, the attachment, the things that had never quite made sense, suddenly making terrible sense. "No," Caroline said again, but with less certainty. "If this were true, why wouldn't someone have told me? Why would everyone have lied?" "Because your father, Charles Grantham, needed an heir," Freeman said, "and because the law at the time made it possible for him to take what he wanted and hide the truth." Caroline stood abruptly. "I need to speak with my father." "He's not your father," Thomas said, speaking for the first time. "Not biologically, that's the point." Caroline turned to him, her expression hostile. "And who are you to tell me who my father is?" "I'm your brother," Thomas said flatly. "Your actual brother. We have the same mother, the same birthmark, the same blood. The only difference is I got raised in a slave cabin while you got raised in the big house." Caroline stared at him, and Sarah saw her trying to process this additional layer of impossible information. "Brother," she repeated numbly. "Half-brother," Thomas corrected. "We have different fathers, but same mother, which makes us siblings whether you like it or not." "Thomas," Sarah said warningly, but he ignored her. "You want to know something funny?" Thomas continued, his voice bitter. "I watched you grow up. Watched Mama nurse you and rock you and sing to you while I was left with whoever had time to watch the slave children. I hated you for it. Spent years hating you, thinking you'd stolen my mother. And it turns out I was right, but not in the way I thought. You didn't steal her, she was always yours. He just made sure neither of you knew it. Caroline's breathing had become rapid and shallow. She looked at Sarah with something like desperation. Is it true? Are you my mother? Sarah wanted to say yes, simply and cleanly, wanted to claim her daughter after 17 years of unknowing. But the truth was more complicated than that. I gave birth to you, Sarah said carefully. My body made you, carried you, brought you into this world. But Charles Grantham raised you as his daughter. He made all the decisions about your life. He's the one you call father. So I don't know what that makes me to you. Your mother by birth, certainly. But whether I'm your mother in any other sense, that's something you'd have to decide. Caroline's eyes filled with tears. This changes everything, she whispered. My whole life, everything I thought I was. It's all a lie. Not all of it, Sarah said. You're still the same person you were this morning. You're still Caroline. You're still smart and kind and strong. The only thing that's different is now you know the whole truth about where you came from. But I'm not white, Caroline said, and there was horror in her voice. If you're my mother, if this is all true, then I'm not white. What am I? The question hung in the air like poison. Thomas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Welcome to the fundamental question of American life, he said. What are you when you're neither one thing nor the other? When you look white but you've got black blood? When you've been raised with all the privileges of whiteness, but that was built on a lie? Thomas, that's enough, Sarah said sharply. Is it? Thomas stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She gets to find out she's got some black blood and act like the world is ending, like it's some kind of tragedy. Do you know what would happen if this got out publicly? She'd lose everything. Her social standing, her marriage prospects, her entire future. And that's supposed to be tragic, the fact that she'd have to live the way we've always lived. It is tragic, Sarah said. For her it is. She's losing the only identity she's ever known. And whose fault is that? Thomas shot back. Not hers, certainly. Not yours either. But she got to have a whole life you were denied, and now she wants our sympathy because that life was built on a lie. I don't have sympathy left for that. Caroline was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. She looked at Sarah with something like pleading in her eyes. What do I do? What am I supposed to do with this? Sarah crossed the room and did something she'd never done in 17 years of caring for Caroline. She touched her as a mother would, not as a servant. She put her hands on Caroline's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. You survive, Sarah said. You take the truth, however ugly it is, and you decide who you want to be. You choose whether to acknowledge it publicly or keep it secret. You choose what kind of relationship you want with me and with Thomas, if any. You choose what to do about Charles Grantham. They're all hard choices, and I can't make them for you. But you survive, because that's what we do. Caroline pulled away from her touch. I need time, she said. I need to think about all of this. I need to... She couldn't finish the sentence. She simply turned and left the room, moving fast enough that it was nearly running. Agent Freeman sighed. That went about as well as could be expected. Did it? Thomas asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looked like a complete disaster. Sarah sat down heavily, feeling exhausted to her bones. What happens now? Now we wait, Freeman said. We wait to see what Caroline decides. Because ultimately, she's the one with the power here. She's white passing, legally documented as Charles Grantham's daughter, and of legal age. If she chooses to reject this information, there's nothing anyone can do to force her to acknowledge it. So we're right back where we started, Sarah said. Powerless. Not exactly, Freeman said. Because now the truth is known, at least by some people. And truth has a way of spreading, even when people try to contain it. Caroline didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. She stayed in her room, taking meals delivered by the household staff, ignoring all attempts at conversation. Mr. Grantham paced the house like a ghost, hollow-eyed and silent. Helen stayed in her rooms with the twins, making it clear she wanted nothing to do with the scandal unfolding in her household. On the 4th day, Caroline emerged. She found Sarah in the kitchen and said simply, I want to know everything. From the beginning. Tell me about your life before you came here. They sat in Sarah's room, the same small space adjacent to the nursery where Sarah had spent so many sleepless nights rocking Caroline as an infant. Sarah told her everything, about being sold at auction while pregnant, about arriving at the plantation terrified and alone, about Thomas's birth, and the years of watching him grow up at a distance. She told Caroline about being summoned to the nursery that first night, about nursing a baby she didn't know was her own, about the slow accumulation of love and resentment and guilt that had defined the years since. Caroline listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When Sarah finished, Caroline was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Show me the birthmark." Sarah pulled down the shoulder of her dress, revealing her left shoulder where an identical mark to Caroline's had faded with age but remained visible. Caroline stared at it, then slowly undid the buttons at her shoulder and revealed her own mark. They were unmistakably the same size, the same shape, the same distinctive pattern. "I used to hate this mark," Caroline said softly. "I thought it was ugly. Asked Father if there was a way to remove it. He told me it made me unique, that I should be proud of it." She laughed bitterly. "I guess he had reasons for wanting me to keep it." "It's how I knew," Sarah said. "The moment those agents showed me the records and mentioned the birthmark, I knew, because Thomas has the same one, in the exact same place. I'd seen yours 1,000 times when you were young and never made the connection." "Why would you?" Caroline said. "You had no reason to think I was your daughter. You were told I was Margaret Grantham's child, and why would you question that?" She paused. "Did you love her, Margaret?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I barely knew her. She was kind enough before she married Mr. Grantham, but after the wedding, she withdrew from everyone, and I only saw her a few times before she died. So no, I didn't love her, but I pitied her, I think. She seemed so unhappy. She killed herself, didn't she?" Caroline said. "The overdose wasn't an accident." "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "No one knows, but it's possible. Because she couldn't live with what they'd done," Caroline said. "Taking your child and pretending it was hers. She couldn't live with that lie. Maybe. Or maybe she just couldn't live with her own pain anymore. Depression kills people, Caroline. It's not always about one specific thing." Caroline stood and walked to the window, the same window Sarah had stared out countless times during the long nights of Caroline's infancy. "I've been thinking about what Thomas said, about me having all the privileges he was denied. He's right, isn't he? I got to be white because someone decided I looked white enough to pass. And that gave me everything while he got nothing." "You were a baby," Sarah said. "None of that was your fault." "But I benefited from it," Caroline said. "I still benefit from it. Right now, this moment, I'm benefiting from the fact that I look white. If I walked away from this house and never told anyone about my real parentage, I could have a completely normal life. I could marry well, have children, move in society, never face any of the consequences that you and Thomas face every day. And the only thing stopping that is my conscience." "So what are you going to do?" Caroline turned to face her. "I don't know. The truth is, I'm terrified. If this becomes public knowledge, my life as I know it ends. I'll be ostracized, unmarriageable, possibly subject to all the discriminatory laws that govern colored people's lives. But if I keep it secret, I'm complicit in the lie that destroyed our family. I'm choosing whiteness over truth, privilege over integrity." "There's no right answer," Sarah said. "Whatever you choose will cost you something." "I know. But here's what I do know. You're my mother. Biologically, unquestionably, you're my mother. And I've spent 17 years calling you Mammy while you served me and cared for me and loved me without ever being acknowledged as what you really were. That's not right. That can't continue." "So what are you saying?" Caroline took a deep breath. "I'm saying I want to acknowledge you publicly as my mother. I want to correct the legal records, change my birth certificate, make it officially known that Sarah Hayes gave birth to me. I want Thomas acknowledged as my brother, and I want Charles Grantham held accountable for what he did." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Caroline, do you understand what that means for you?" "I understand it means giving up the life I thought I'd have. I understand it means facing discrimination and hatred and possibly violence. But I also understand that I can't build a life on a lie that hurt you this badly. I can't be complicit in that, Mama." She said the last word tentatively, as if testing it out. "Is it all right if I call you that, Mama?" Sarah couldn't speak around the tightness in her throat. She simply nodded. "Then that's settled," Caroline said, with more confidence than Sarah thought she actually felt. "Agent Freeman said he could help with the legal process. It will require going to court, testifying publicly, facing Mr. Grantham in front of a judge. Are you willing to do that?" "Yes," Sarah said. "If you're willing to stand beside me and claim me as your mother, then yes, I'll face anything. This mystery shows us how the cruelest deceptions can hide in plain sight for years, and how truth, once revealed, demands courage to acknowledge. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Caroline made the right choice? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Let's continue with how this all ended. The legal proceedings took place in September of 1869 in the Burke County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with spectators. The case had become notorious throughout the region, drawing attention from as far as Atlanta and Charleston. A white man accused of stealing a black woman's child and raising it as his own. It was scandalous in ways that transcended the usual boundaries of post-war racial tensions. Sarah testified first, describing the circumstances of Caroline's birth or what she remembered of it, the labor, the exhaustion, the hazy period afterward when she'd been told her baby had died and been buried quickly due to concern about fever. She'd been so weakened by the delivery that she'd believed it, hadn't questioned why she hadn't been allowed to see the body or attend any burial. "I grieved my daughter for 3 weeks," Sarah told the court, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "And then Mr. Grantham brought me to the nursery and told me to nurse his infant. I never suspected that baby was mine. Why would I? I'd been told my child was dead." Dr. Patterson's widow testified next, reading from her late husband's journals. The entries detailed Charles Grantham's desperation for an heir, the arrangement they'd made. The doctor would attend Sarah's labor, take the healthy infant if it was light-skinned enough, and tell Sarah the baby had died. He would then tell Margaret Grantham, already heavily sedated, that she'd delivered a daughter. The timing had worked because Margaret's supposed pregnancy had been faked using padding, her reclusive behavior during that period ensuring no one examined her closely enough to know she wasn't actually pregnant. "My husband," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight with shame, "was paid $500 for his participation in this fraud. He recorded it in his journal as payment for services rendered in the matter of the Grantham succession. I found these journals after his death last year and didn't understand what they meant until the federal agents came asking questions." Thomas testified about the birthmark, about growing up watching his mother care for the Grantham children while he was left with minimal attention. He testified about the emotional devastation of feeling abandoned, of not understanding why his mother seemed to love white children more than him. "I thought I wasn't good enough," he said, and his voice broke. "I thought there was something wrong with me that made my own mother not want me. And all along, she was taking care of my sister. She was doing what any mother would do, caring for her child, but neither of them knew the truth of it." Caroline testified last. She stood before the court in a simple dress, her hair pulled back severely, looking younger than her 18 years. She confirmed the birthmark, confirmed that she'd been told all her life she was Margaret and Charles Grantham's biological daughter, confirmed that she'd had no idea of the truth until the federal agents revealed it. Then she said, "I stand here today to acknowledge that Sarah Hayes is my mother by birth. I was stolen from her as an infant and raised under a false identity. I benefited from that theft for 18 years, living as a white girl with all the privileges that entails, while my brother worked in the fields and my mother served in the household that should have been partly hers. I can't undo those years. I can't give back what was taken, but I can tell the truth now. And I can say that Charles Grantham committed a fraud that destroyed my family before I even knew I had a family to destroy. Charles Grantham's attorney argued that the entire case was based on speculation, that the birthmark could be coincidence, that the journals could be misinterpreted, that Caroline was confused and manipulated by federal agents with political motivations. But the evidence was overwhelming, and even the Georgia judge, who'd clearly hoped to find a way to dismiss the case, couldn't ignore it. The ruling came down in October. The court found that Caroline Margaret Grantham was in fact Caroline Hayes, biological daughter of Sarah Hayes, and that her birth certificate had been fraudulently filed. The certificate was corrected to reflect Sarah Hayes as mother, with the father listed as unknown. Charles Grantham was fined $2,000 for fraud and forced to pay an additional $5,000 in restitution to Sarah Hayes for services rendered under false pretenses. He was not charged criminally. The statute of limitations had expired, and there was reluctance to set precedents that might open wealthy white families to prosecution for various Reconstruction-era violations. But the social consequences were severe. He was ostracized by polite society. His business relationships crumbled, and within a year he'd sold the plantation and moved to Texas to start over where no one knew his history. The ruling also determined that as Caroline was now legally recognized as a person of African descent, Georgia's one-drop rule made this automatic once the parentage was established. She was entitled to none of the Grantham estate. Everything that had been designated as her inheritance reverted to the estate to be divided among Charles Grantham's other legal heirs, Helen and the twins. Caroline lost everything: her name, her inheritance, her social position, her entire future as she'd imagined it. She became, in the eyes of the law and society, colored. All the doors that had been open to her slammed shut. But she gained a family. Sarah, Caroline, and Thomas left Burke County together that November, traveling to Savannah where Thomas had established himself. They took the money from the court settlement, $7,000, more than Sarah had imagined she'd ever see in her lifetime, and used it to buy a small house near the shipyards. Thomas found work for Caroline as a clerk in the shipping company's office, a position she could hold because she could read and write and calculate figures faster than most of the male employees. She worked under her new legal name, Caroline Hayes. The other clerks treated her with the casual prejudice reserved for colored people who'd gotten above their station, but the work was steady and the pay was fair. Sarah started a laundry business, using some of the settlement money to buy equipment and supplies. She employed other women from the neighborhood, providing steady work at fair wages. It was hard work, exhausting work, but it was hers. No one could take it from her. The three of them, mother, daughter, and son, built a life together. It wasn't the life any of them had imagined. Caroline would never marry into society or preside over a plantation household. Thomas would never fully trust that his mother loved him as much as she loved Caroline. Sarah would never recover the years she'd lost with either of her children. But they had each other. They had truth. And they had freedom. Real freedom, not the complicated freedom of being black in the post-war South, but the freedom that comes from knowing who you are and choosing to live accordingly. Caroline never spoke to Charles Grantham again. He wrote to her once, a long letter explaining his motivations, begging for understanding if not forgiveness. She burned the letter without reading it all the way through. Some apologies, she told Sarah, aren't worth hearing. Some things can't be forgiven, and trying just gives the person who hurt you more power. Sarah thought that was probably true. She'd spent 17 years raising her daughter without knowing it, serving the man who'd stolen from her, loving a child while her son felt abandoned. No apology could make that right. But on Sunday evenings, when the three of them sat together in their small parlor, Thomas reading the newspaper, Caroline working on her correspondence, Sarah mending clothes, she felt something like peace. It wasn't happiness exactly, wasn't justice, wasn't restoration of all that had been taken, but it was truth. It was family. And after everything, after all the lies and theft and cruelty, that was something. Years later, after Sarah had died and been buried in the colored cemetery in Savannah, Caroline would tell the story to her own children. She'd eventually married a teacher named James Reed who didn't care about her complicated past. She'd tell them about the grandmother they'd never met, about the years of unknowing, about the moment when truth finally broke through decades of deception. "Your grandmother," she'd tell them, "was the strongest person I ever knew. She survived being enslaved, survived having her children stolen and scattered, survived discovering that her entire life had been built on a lie. And she still found the strength to love me, to forgive me for benefiting from what was stolen from her. That's what strength really looks like. Remember that." And they would remember. The story would pass down through generations. A reminder of the everyday cruelties that built America, of the families destroyed by slavery's logic, of the truth that ultimately emerges no matter how deeply it's buried. The slave forced to raise her master's children had, in the end, raised her own daughter. It had taken 18 years and a war and federal agents and a public trial to make it true. But truth, once revealed, changes everything. Even when it comes too late to undo the harm, truth still matters. Truth is still worth fighting for, because without it, we're all just living in someone else's lie, serving someone else's purpose, loving without knowing who we really are. Sarah Hayes knew that, and in the end, she made sure her daughter knew it too.